Welcome to Genos Historia, a channel dedicated to explain the cool new things that DNA, especially ancient DNA, is revealing about the ancestral history of human populations. This video is episode 3 of a 9-episode series I'm making on Viking ancient DNA. Here in episode 3, I'll be looking at ancient DNA from Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands. These are the northern Atlantic islands which were colonized by Norwegians in the Viking Age. The history behind the settlements of these islands is pretty fascinating, and it's nice to get ancient DNA from its early settlers. Margarman 2020 sequenced 57 ancient DNA samples from these islands, 46 of which could be uploaded to the G25 PCA from the Eurogenes blog, and which I could therefore study and come to my own conclusions about what they show. The biggest thing that their DNA shows is that most of the early settlers of these islands had at least some Irish/Scottish ancestry. Only 32% of the early settlers in Iceland and Greenland were 100% Norwegian, while 43% of them show mixed Norwegian and Scottish/Irish ancestry, and 25% of them are 100% Scottish/Irish. What this high percentage of people with Scottish/Irish admixture means is that many of the early settlers of Greenland and Iceland and the Faroe Islands were what historians call Hiberno-Norse. What Hiberno-Norse are Nordic people who lived in Norwegian Viking territory in Ireland and Scotland. They didn't live in Norway. Often these Hiberno-Norse people, due to living outside of Norway for generations, had Scottish/Irish admixture. This is not a huge surprise at all because even the ancient Icelandic sagas mention plenty of Hiberno-Norse people who settled these islands. There's more to say about these DNA results from Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands than that, but before I get into those results, I want to give some historical context about the Norwegian colonizations of these remote North Atlantic islands. When I decided to make this episode, I didn't know anything about the history, so I had to look up on Wikipedia just to get some basic facts about it, and what I learned is pretty fascinating. So what I learned is basically Norwegian Vikings were pioneers who explored areas of the Atlantic Ocean which no humans had explored before. And they weren't just exploring the Atlantic Ocean, they were colonizing pretty much every large island that existed in the North Atlantic. Many of which had never been inhabited by humans before. And they successfully created permanent, healthy communities in these remote islands. These islands include, of course, the Orkney Islands, the Shetland Islands, the Faroe Islands, Iceland, and Greenland. They even went as far as North America, where they tried to create a colony on an island off the coast of Canada which they called Vinland. But according to the Icelandic sagas, this colony in Vinland in North America was abandoned very shortly after they built it because of constant attacks and raids by the Native American tribes. So they just kind of felt it wasn't worth it to try to build little colonies here with a few hundred people if all of the native tribes around them would be constantly attacking them, so they left. But some people do think that these Vikings made it even further into North America. But that's beyond the scope of this video. I don't mean to give the impression, as it may seem that I am, that these Norwegian Viking colonies are a thing of the past, because the communities that they established in Iceland and the Faroe Islands still exist today 1,000 years later. They never disappeared. And in fact, in these islands, the memories of the Viking Age and the memories of the ancient mythology of Scandinavian people survived better than it did in Scandinavia itself, thanks to books written by Icelandic authors in the 1100s and 1200s. And in the Faroe Islands, they have a unique way of remembering this past in their traditional music. Many of their traditional songs are based on the Icelandic sagas and other stories from the Viking Age. So a lot of people in the Faroe Islands today, 1,000 years later, are still growing up hearing songs about the first kings of Norway, Sigmund the Dragon Slayer, and other very old stories. So the memory of the Viking past is not at all forgotten in these islands. So now that I've given historical context of these Norwegian Viking colonies on the North Atlantic, let's look at the ancient DNA results from them. So let's first look at the results from Iceland and Greenland that date to about 1000 AD. There's 12 DNA results from Greenland and 16 from Iceland. 1000 AD is around the year when the first settlements were created in Greenland. So we're looking at some of the earliest settlers in Greenland. However, the first settlements in Iceland were made in 870 AD, so these are early Icelanders, but not the very first. Anyways, all of these samples from Greenland and Iceland fit into 3 ancestry categories, and I have on the screen the percentages of them who fit into each of these categories. The first category is Norwegian, 100%. The second category is mixed Norwegian and Scottish/Irish, and the second category is Scottish/Irish, 100%. 32% of them are 100% Norwegian, 43% of them are mixed Norwegian, Scottish-Irish, and 25% of them are 100% Scottish-Irish. With these results, we can deduce some things about the history of the settlement of Iceland and Greenland. So the ones who are 100% Norwegian, we can deduce that they came to Greenland and Iceland straight from Norway. The ones who are mixed Norwegian and Scottish and Irish, we can deduce were Hiberno-Norse, meaning that they came from Norwegian territories in the British Isles. And the ones who are 100% Scottish-Irish, we can deduce were people from the native communities in the British Isles who came with Vikings to Iceland and Greenland, possibly as slaves, but possibly not. My big takeaway of what all this means, like I said in the beginning of the video, is that there were a lot more Hiberno-Norse people who were involved in the settlement of Iceland and Greenland than would be assumed from the history, at least from Wikipedia articles that people like me who don't know a lot about it read, especially when we read that these were Norwegian Vikings. But apparently a lot of them had mixed ancestry. But I don't want to exaggerate or overemphasize the Scottish/Irishness of these Hiberno-Norse people, because they were born in Norwegian colonies and they spoke Norwegian. And when I look at their Y DNA, I see that all of the Hiberno-Norse males in Iceland and Greenland, they all belong to Norwegian Y DNA lineages. And this depreciates their level of Scottish/Irishness, because what it means is that their paternal lineages were Norwegian. It means that their fathers and grandfathers were Norwegian, and let's be honest, their Norwegian grandfathers and fathers had a much bigger influence on who they were than their Scottish and Irish mothers. So their identity, their language, their culture would have been mostly Norwegian, even though they had mixed ancestry. That covers the DNA from the early settlers in Iceland and Greenland. The next ancient DNA to look at comes from the Faroe Islands. These Faroe Islands are pretty remote, just like Iceland and Greenland are, but they're not as remote. You can see them on this map. The first Norwegian Viking settlers came here in 820 AD, but the DNA samples I'm looking at come from much later, 1500 to 1600 AD. So they're not from the Viking age, but they were definitely the descendants of Viking settlers on these islands, and they help us understand what kind of population these settlements created. What the DNA shows is that by 1500 AD, a homogeneous population had formed in the Faroe Islands. So its original settlers 700 years later would have been a combination of Norwegian, Hiberno-Norse, and Scottish and Irish people, like what we see in the early settlers in Greenland and Iceland. But after 500 years of living together in the Faroe Islands, all these early settlers would have melted together and created this new homogeneous population. As for how much Norwegian versus Scottish/Irish ancestry the Faroe Islands have, my guess looking at the DNA is actually they were more Scottish/Irish than Norwegian. My guess is roughly 60% Scottish/Irish and 40% Norwegian, which is kind of surprising, but don't take these percentages too seriously, because Scottish and Irish and Norwegian are so closely related that it can be hard to tell the difference between them. But in terms of their Y DNA, which is their paternally inherited DNA, these early modern DNA samples from the Faroe Islands are much more Norwegian than Scottish/Irish. 8 of 10 of the males, which is 80%, have Norwegian Y DNA, even though the majority of their ancestry seems to be Scottish/Irish. So this tells the same story that we see in the Y DNA in Greenland and Iceland, which is that the Hibernal Norse people who settled these islands were the sons of Norwegian Vikings who married Scottish and Irish women. There's no modern DNA from the Faroe Islands to look at to compare to these samples from the 15 and 1600s, but it's probably pretty safe to assume that they're identical. But there is modern DNA from Iceland in the G25 PCA that I looked at, and looking at Icelandic DNA, I was surprised to see that there's some variation from individual to individual in terms of Scottish, Irish, and Scandinavian ancestry, with some individuals being mostly Scottish/Irish and some being mostly Norwegian. But I'm not super confident in these numbers. The average that I got for modern Iceland is 60% Norwegian and 40% Scottish/Irish. Alright, well that's it for this video on ancient DNA from the Viking colonies in the North Atlantic Seas. I hope you found it interesting. I hope you found the history of these islands interesting and how I was able to look at the DNA and get some clues about the history and who the settlers of these islands were. Stay tuned for my next episode, where I'll be looking at 34 DNA samples from a huge Viking ship burial in Estonia.